Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched Wall Street from 1987. This is a movie I've heard talked about a lot, and I think it was a movie that was fairly popular around the time when it came out. But for various reasons that I'll speculate about probably later, I think it's also a movie that probably a lot of people these days have not actually seen and are more familiar with it for its pop culture relevancy. In fact, I think you're more likely to know the name of the titular villain, question mark, being Gordon Gekko, than you are the name of the movie itself, or recognize that he's from this movie. This is the movie that very famously is misquoted as saying greed is good. The actual quote is greed for lack of a better word is good. And it's also a movie that has come up numerous times over the years as, for some reason, being an inspiration for people to become stockbrokers, which is insane, because this is not a movie about being a stockbroker. This is a movie about being a criminal and a generally psychopathic, evil person. And I do not understand how you could watch this film and take much else from it. There's a little bit of finesse in there, but we'll get to it. This is a movie that I don't really hear people talk about it as a piece of cinema, and I kind of understand why. I don't think this is a great piece of cinema. It's not, a legendary cinematic experience, writing experience. Its story is not particularly complicated, and its acting is not particularly amazing generally either, with some exceptions. And so it's a little bit of it's not the most compelling film to want to go back and watch, other than what I would say for its cultural relevancy. One of the other reasons that I personally speculate this movie may have fallen off in popularity or not be as talked about these days is the levels of evil and criminality that are presented in this movie are, in this day and age, almost borderline laughable. And it is a reminder to me of all of the financial shenanigans that I have been privy to in my not that long time on this planet. Just in my time here, I was born after this movie was made. Just in my time, I have seen a lot of other financial shenanigans go on, whether it's the 2008 financial crisis or any number of smaller financial things that went on. I mean, Enron and all number of other things that went on over the last 30-ish years that really were financially ruining and exposed just the depths of which certain people in financial markets and in business are willing to stoop in order to make a buck. And so this movie, by modern standards, is almost quaint. Now, to be totally honest, the reason why I was looking at a couple of financial movies but ended up on this one for watching this week is because this week I was thinking about the current the current state of the financial system, shall we say. And it is a financially insecure time for a lot of people. It is making a lot of people nervous for a lot of reasons, kind of regardless of what level of income or saved or savings you have. And so unless you're in, the 1%, you're not happy with the way financial markets are right now. And in addition to just, this is coming both from a political and a business side, it's just a very nasty time. And it's very apparent to anyone who's been paying a little bit of attention that the lack of oversight and regulation in a lot of industries and in the financial industry as well, in a more meta sense, has really led us down a pretty nasty path to where we are right now. And so this movie is kind of a reminder of, again, a simpler, almost a simpler time when the kinds of financial manipulations were simpler, and the amount of obfuscation between investments and reality was seemingly less so. Just as a sidebar, I want it on the record so I can cite it some other time. The AI market and the tech market right now is a bubble. It is absolutely a bubble. I do not see how it could not be a bubble, and it is going to burst at some point. And the best I can tell is that all of these companies, this handful of companies, it's mostly like 4 or 5 companies and then a bunch of smaller ones, these really enormous tech firms are all selling fake shit to each other. Well, it's real stuff. They're selling reality, they are selling real things to each other and doing these enormous financial exchanges that are pumping up their stock value. And best I can tell, there is no way for them currently to sell. It is all about future imagined shit, basically. There is no market for AI, really, at least not to the level it would need to be to pay out what the speculation is going on here. And so basically best I can tell, they are all either hoping that something magically comes along to make this investment valid or worth it, or actually be worth some amount of money to somebody, or they are hoping that as they all trade money back, they are trading money back and forth with each other with one hand and pointing a gun with the other. And they are all hoping that they are not the one who is, they are the one that is holding the money and not the one who is left with expectations and nothing to show. So yeah, it's a big fucking bubble and it's going to be a disaster, and I look forward to yet another financial crisis in my lifetime. It's going to be wonderful. Anyway, sidebar over. Sorry. That's what got me to watching this movie. So this is a movie that's directed and written by Oliver Stone. There's another writer as well on it. And you know, Oliver Stone is a name I know fairly well, but I'm realizing in reflecting on it that I don't really know his filmography very well at all. He's fairly prolific. I think I've only seen like 2 of his movies before, and frankly, both of them are kind of unremarkable in terms of their direction and cinematography and all that. And I think this one actually maybe stands out a little bit more in terms of cinematography. It's not fantastic by any means. It's more visually interesting. I should caveat this more often, but when I say cinematography, I know that the director is not the cinematographer, but often they work together and the director has a substantial amount of influence on what cinematography looks like. I recognize those are not the same things, and if you weren't aware, that is the case. Sometimes the director is the cinematographer, but often not. So it is hard to separate unless you're actually on a set like that. It is very often hard to separate how much of the look of a film is down to the director versus the cinematographer. Usually, more often than not, the cinematographer is a little bit more about execution than the director is, to my understanding. But I've actually got some friends in the industry who I should ask for some clarification on that. Anyway, another sidebar. I don't know Oliver Stone's work particularly well. I think this movie is okay visually. It has some very 80s and 90s shots to it that are kind of archaic by modern standards. Not because there's anything wrong with them, but because just visual expectations have changed. There's a lot of sort of panning shots and what look like they should be dolly shots, but they're sort of choppy. They look almost like they could be hand cam or like steady cam, but there's a lot of sort of follow shots that are shot in such a way that is sort of not done anymore. I think that is interesting enough. It is unique enough that is one of its features rather than flaws. It is unique in that way, but it's also sort of more of a feature of the era than it is of this particular movie. Generally speaking, I think this movie looks fine. I think its cinematography is fine, but it's not really anything to write home about. Similarly, with a lot of the other sort of visual aspects, whether that's the costumes and the sets, the lighting, all those sorts of things, I think it's mostly just very serviceable, which I actually think is a very missed opportunity for a movie that is clearly being very critical of or at least, it's being very critical of the entirety of Wall Street generally, and this sort of attitude that was pervasive at the time about how money should be treated. This is in a way an indictment of a sort of an era. There's a whole financial collapse that happened in 1989 as well. Not as big and notable as some of the others, but it is interesting to note that 2 years later there would be a big crash. And the ups and downs of the stock market are something I could talk a bunch about, not because I'm a particular expert, but because I find the history behind it particularly fascinating. But I digress, and I won't get too much into that. Generally speaking, this movie, as I said, is fairly simple. It's not trying to do a particularly complicated narrative with a lot of characters who are incredibly deep. It's a fairly basic story that I don't think it's a spoiler to tell the setup, which is basically we've got Charlie Sheen playing a young stockbroker, I believe is the right term, who is sort of in a junior position, and he looks up to this other massive figure on the market, Gordon Gekko, played by Michael Douglas, who is like known as, he's sort of even known from the very beginning as sort of an evil guy who he's referred to as a raider, who basically just does underhanded things to buy up companies with huge financial backing, and then sort of tear them apart so that they can be sold off for profit. Decimating the company and ruining the lives of all the people who worked there or built anything there, or that sort of thing. And that is basically the arc of the entire movie. Is guy looks up to him, guy works for him, guy learns not to look up to him anymore. That's basically the arc of the movie. I don't think that's a spoiler. So it's not a particularly complicated narrative. So what's really going to matter for a narrative like that is the characters who are on screen and how they interact and how those actors perform. I don't think I've ever talked about Charlie Sheen. Maybe I feel like I have, but I can't remember what movie. I don't think we've watched a movie with him in it. Charlie Sheen is a pretty messed up person, and I also don't think he's a good actor. I think he's a particularly poor actor. Not like atrocious. He's completely serviceable in a very limited capacity, but he doesn't even like come up to the level of only plays variations of himself. He basically only plays himself. And so it's hard. it's hard to, when he's our main character, it is hard to particularly like him when he's not performed in the best way, especially when the focus of the film is basically about his personal arc, going from sort of young and hungry and naive to learning a bit more about the industry. It's also that is also a dependency for his believability when he has certain things happen to him, good or bad. When you are trying to, have this devilish character in Michael Douglas, who is really like so clearly framed from the start as being totally without foibles, who is going to eat everybody up. Like from the very first scene where the two of them interact, it's very clear that Gordon Gekko, Michael Douglas's character, has no intention of truly showing this person any respect, or that he shows anybody else in the room with him really any respect. This is the archetype of a person, or a variation on a person, that most people have met before. Somebody who is so without scruples and without care for, for the people around them, and is a very like fair weather friend in terms of like not really being a friend at all, only being somebody who's interested in you as long as you can provide something for them. There's a lot of sort of psychological archetypes that falls into, or has some crossover with. I would certainly say this is sort of in the psychopathy realm of things, less so than the narcissism. He's not particularly narcissistic. He's just like completely without any moral or ethical concerns. As long as he can get rid of it, get away with it, he thinks he's in the right. And he's very steady throughout the movie. He plays against certain people in certain ways, especially Sheen's character, Bud Fox. Bud Fox is such a like it's such a innocent sounding name. Bud is like, I don't know, it's kind of an old-timey name to begin with, but it's also it to me conjures a certain level of like naivete and young, sort of a young feeling of somebody who doesn't know the world, right? And so the movie is very direct, even within a scene, to show that when Bud leaves a room, that he is not it's not every scene, but it does it often enough to reiterate to you, when Bud leaves a room, he's not being respected. He's not being, whatever. He's not in the loop with this. He's a tool. He's being seen as a tool, a means to an end for Gekko's intentions, not somebody who Gekko actually respects and wants to partner with, just somebody who can be used up and thrown out like everybody else, and like all of the, the companies that he's shredded before. And so there's this interesting dichotomy where you want to like Bud and maybe even root for him, and maybe even feel bad for him, but Charlie Sheen's performance is so like barely passable that it's hard sometimes to even notice or believe his arc, because it is so ham-fistedly portrayed. He goes from his performance in the beginning, middle, and end of the films are all, it's all very different, because he's in very different places as a person. But really it feels less like he's playing a different character and more like he's playing Bud Fox at the beginning, and then he's playing Charlie Sheen playing Michael Douglas playing Gordon Gekko in the middle, because he picks up all these mannerisms from Gekko and all these other things. And it would be one thing if Sheen was putting on a good performance, but he's not. And so instead of it seeming like the character having been negatively influenced by this mentor, instead it just, I'm taken out of it and it feels like the actor mimicking another actor. I hope that kind of makes sense. And then at the end, he's like sort of back to being sort of in between the two and remorseful and a little bit, he's a little bit smarter. He's a little bit more worldly and a little bit more wise, and trying to, maybe fix some of the things that he's been involved with, or, well, I won't spoil the film. But Sheen's performance is just kind of so barely passing. It's fine. It's serviceable. It works okay. But I can't get past the feeling that it would have been dramatically better had there been a more compelling character there, or a more compelling actor there to play that character. Daryl Hannah is also given a headline role on this movie, which is weird because she's a very minor character and also performs terribly. I believe she's basically known as a model mostly, I thought, but I might be mistaken about that. But yeah, her performance is like really poor. Yeah, Michael Douglas, on the other hand, is like putting on the performance of a lifetime. I've seen him in a few other things. I quite like him most of the time. He's not somebody who plays particularly varied roles. He plays a lot of sort of similar types of ethically gray at the minimum kind of characters. People who are a little bit very in sort of business, kind of conniving, very out for themselves type of characters. Those are all very often in his wheelhouse, or at least in the things that I've seen him in. And so, but this is probably the best performance I've seen from him. I'm very impressed. He, by and large, carries the movie with his performance. Without him, this movie, I truly think, would not work, because he oozes this level of lack of care, this level of willingness to be evil and say he's gonna do evil things with a straight face, but with enough charisma that people cheer for him when they do it, when he says it. But he's just enough over the evil line where I don't think there's any way you could misinterpret him cinematically, right? He is intentionally turned up to 11 in order to remind you that despite some of the things he's saying sounding like they sometimes kind of make sense, that he is out for himself and he is manipulating everybody in the room and all these other things. And it's an interesting counterpoint because so many of the scenes are sort of framed as him as the investor versus these companies that are framed as sort of bloated, antiquated, underperforming, all these other sorts of things, attitudes that I think at the time for the 80s and 90s had a sort of a different attitude about, we're moving into the technological era. We need to advance past, the kinds of things that it was a very different time for the economy and for businesses, and businesses were transferring into the the computing era. And so there is sort of a validity to, let's take out some of the bloat, let's take out some of the overmanagement, let's undo some of the buildup of bureaucracy or these other things that existed for a long time in a company or something like that. And he starts to sound sort of compelling, and that's the only concession I can make to the type of people who have apparently been all over the place, saying, like, thousands of people have approached these actors and said, I was inspired by you. because that's the only thing I can say. It's like, if you are really you have to really misread this movie dramatically. And I think have to be kind of a sociopath yourself to take away from this that it is about Wall Street or about stock trading or about business in general. It is really about crime. It is really about being an evil, unscrupulous person and, you know, enriching yourself at the cost of everything and everyone. So I will give it that Michael Douglas as Gordon Gekko is so convincingly charming that if you take away, if you are putting it up against these, you know, businesses that look like they're being neglected, and you ignore a lot of what he says and more go off of his vibe instead, I can sort of see it, but you really have to have the blinders on to take only that instead of all of the I'll backstab you and tear everything you love apart and, you know, hurt anyone I want for any reason. I couldn't care less. It's just insane, but it's a testament to Michael Douglas's performance that, you know, he's so compelling as a villain. In a lot of ways, this movie reminded me of a couple of movies. One of them, it was actually The Devil's Advocate, which we watched some time ago now, where, you know, you have this younger, more naive character versus like older, you know, root of all evil type of character in a much more realistic kind of scenario than The Devil's Advocate, obviously, but a similar type of vibe. I think this is probably the better movie. Although it's been a little while, I can't remember how much. Yeah, I think this is the better movie probably, because it's the same. It's that same sort of articulation of naivete and that same being manipulated without recognizing the situation that you're in that kind of goes on throughout the movie. Weirdly enough, I also compared this movie very closely to Trading Places, which came out 4 years before this movie, because at its core, it kind of follows some pretty similar beats. I mean, this is a very loose narrative to begin with, and so maybe I'm putting too much emphasis on that. But the sort of the arc of a learning, a rise, and then a fall, and then sort of a comeuppance, those sorts of steps, and it all being set on the, you know, in Wall Street, on trading floors and those sorts of things. You know, it's a very kind of funny thing to compare, but it's hard not to, despite the fact that those are diametrically opposed movies. I mean, Trading Places is fantastic, very funny. It's a little bit antiquated in some of its contents, but by all means, but you know, it's a very comedic film versus this, which is very dramatic and serious, and, you know, it's taking itself very seriously too. But it ultimately follows sort of a similar arc that I couldn't help but compare. But it's not, yeah, again, it's not trying to, this movie is not trying to be particularly complicated. It's not trying to be particularly deep. And like the character evolution, regardless of the performers, whether they are good or bad, and we have both, is not doing a ton. And I think that works to its advantage. I think if you overcomplicated this movie with a lot more side narratives, it also already has this side narrative with this love story with Daryl Hannah that is bad and should just disappear. There's really almost no reason for it to be in the film at all. So actually, okay, sidebar, there's the minor spoiler. there's an early scene. There's a scene early on where right after they meet up and they sort of make their first deal, and Gecko sends a prostitute to Fox's apartment to like sort of show him a good time. That singular scene with the prostitute is it has more compelling narrative value in it than the entire arc of the love story with Daryl Hannah, because the prostitute scene makes it very clear in no uncertain but subtextual terms that this is both Gecko plying Fox with like, here's your reward, here's your like monkey brain reward that you did something good for me and now I do something good for you, and that good thing is this very base level sort of disrespectful kind of thing, and then there's sort of a second layer to it, I think, as well, which is it's prostitution, and so it is selling something that isn't real. Not sex work is work, and the people who do that should be respected, but ultimately, like, it's not the same as a real relationship, right? And so to me, I read a second layer in there of like, this is somebody who is performing a service and for money, and this whole movie is so much about money. And so as an indicator of Gecko will buy, he'll spend a couple of bucks to manipulate somebody, it is the perfect scene to articulate exactly this sort of base level mentality that he has when he operates with people, that he will, ply them with whatever he needs to with money, with his money that he has, in order for him to get what he wants, to get more money. Anyway, got a little distracted there. The prostitute scene should stay, and the entire of Daryl Hannah's scenes should go. So, okay, about the rest of the film, there's not too much more to talk about, I think. I mean, this movie is very steeped in sort of 80s feeling. It's a very 80s, late 80s specifically, it's very yuppie. It's a very yuppie kind of thing. It's a very, business is good. While it is being very critical of Wall Street, it is still, acknowledging with some judgment, but not condemning, sort of this yuppie lifestyle that was very much on the rise in the late 80s, and this sort of attitude, cultural attitude that would persist well into the 90s of, business is good and America's on the rise, which is funny because actually Gecko has this narrative in the middle about how America is bloated and needs to be cut down and all these other things. Anyway, that's another tangent. There's some interesting narratives. There is some very good script writing actually in this movie that is not that complicated. And so this movie is it is only worth watching for Michael Douglas's performance, or 90%, I should say, for his performance of stuff, and then the writing that is done for his character in particular, but some others as well, is also can be very entertaining. So while I don't think this is a great film, I think it is a cultural touchstone for sure, and it has enough compelling things in it to make it good in other ways. It is not great cinema, but it can be very entertaining. I've kind of gotten all swapped around on this. I keep talking about Charlie Sheen, but Martin Sheen is also in this movie, and it's very funny because, Martin Sheen is Charlie Sheen's father, real life father. And Martin Sheen is a dramatically better actor. Despite being in very few scenes in this movie, he has always in reality been a much better actor than really all of his children. in my opinion, but it is especially glaring when you know that the two are father and son and they are acting against each other in a scene. And it's like, oh, the main character is a much worse actor than his father who's playing this minor character. Not great. Not a great look there, Charlie. But I digress. There's a couple of other very good actors in here who play more minor roles. Terrence Stamp is an actor who I quite like, who's been in a lot of different things over the years. He's kind of an iconic face. Often plays sort of villainous characters as well. He's got a certain sort of British drawl that is typically associated in cinema with somewhat villainous characters, but he does a really good job in a minor role here as well. And there's a lot of other people who I don't want to diminish their contributions in more minor roles, playing alongside these kind of bigger parts, who do very good jobs. Yeah, it is, like I said, it's steeped in sort of 80s culture. It also has a very 80s soundtrack, sort of lots of synth and drums kind of stuff. It's not too invasive. It's pretty well balanced within the film, but I think if you're not used to hearing it, if you haven't watched a lot of 80s films, it might be a little bit jarring. I could see that. And yeah, I think that mostly covers the plot, the points I usually try and cover. I think this movie is worth watching. The more I talk about it, not because it's great cinema, but because it is a good cultural touchstone. It's also a good it's a good reminder of how people can behave. The depths to which some people are willing or capable to stoop to manipulate others and get what they want, and especially when it comes to business and financial markets and all these other things, the stakes, those are the kinds of industries that people with those behaviors are especially likely to show up in, because they're drawn to it because they can get what they want there, or are more likely to. And so as a critique of an era, the yuppie era that is sort of diminishing in memory, as far as I can tell, and again becoming a little bit quaint by modern standards, it's a very interesting movie. And I guess I do recommend it. It's pretty good. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched, and I'll see you guys next time.